Finance too.
What, if anything, have you learned about how to reduce impact on communities?
Well, in addition to each of the points that I covered, the pushing the best practices, this applies more in the United States, I believe, than to how leasing and rights are distributed in Canada. But a serious engagement and negotiation in the lease, where a private landowner does control the mineral rights to their property, can ensure both the caretaking of their property in particular and the larger community impacts. One of the most interesting ideas that I've heard batted around coming out of New York State is has to do with collective bargaining. A lot of landowners banding together instead of negotiating with the gas company and kind of being overpowered as an individual, possibly without an attorney, which should never happen. There's a collective bargaining effort to negotiate with the gas company on a large scale, representing a very large amount of property, and through a single voice or a single legal office. This arose, no surprise, out of a desire to maximize profits to increase the lease price and the royalty rates, but it's been discussed as a way also to set environmental terms. And I think this is a reminder that at least while they still have their leverage, that individuals and communities do have the ability to get whatever conditions they want in the United States from a drilling company that they want. They're not completely dependent on local regulations. You can demand, for example, clause that will adequately replace your water supply if there's a problem as specifically defined in your lease. You can require that on those lease properties, which maybe in a collectivized arrangement amounts to a couple 100,000 acres, that certain best practices are employed or that waste pits don't exist and so forth. So I think this is a very strong way to protect your local community.
Had the U.S. Safe Drinking Water Act not exempted hydraulic fracturing, what do you think or speculate would have changed with respect to the rate of gas industry expansion in the United States?
It's a really interesting question. The really sort of quippy response is probably until now not much, actually, but that from the recent time period forward, that there's a lot of potential. While the EPA hadn't chosen to regulate hydraulic fracturing when it did have the authority to do so, fracturing wasn't as widely applied or nearly as common as it is today. It has existed for 60 or so years, but not in the technological form that exists today, and not to the degree of application that exists today. So the EPA had a track record for choosing not to regulate hydraulic fracturing, even when it did have the authority before the law was passed in 2005 in the United States, exempting fracturing. But my sources, numerous sources inside the EPA, tell me that they would approach it very differently today, that they would seriously consider regulating hydraulic fracturing similarly to how they regulate other forms of underground injection. Their challenge being that normal disposal wells, underground injection wells, are not nearly as common as hydraulic fracturing, so they need to find some way to both regulate it while expediting and facilitating the process and not really getting in the way to an inappropriate degree in the drilling.
Is the contamination observed coming mostly from shallow, in other words, under 1,000 feet, or deep, over 5,000 feet, deep hydraulic fracturing? What is the relative percentage between the shallow and deep fracturing and contamination?
I can't answer. Nobody, I don't think, can answer that question. I can tell you that in my research, for starters, the vast majority of the water contamination incidents that I've looked at are due to surface contamination, are due to spills or seeping waste pits, just in terms of numbers. That's not to say that there aren't numerous examples where there's underground concerns, but where they are, and I mentioned Jeffrey Thine's research, for example. He's looked at this in one part of Garfield County as closely as anybody, and he still can't definitively answer that question. It's hard to tell when you have, for example, among other issues, a well bore going down 8,000 feet or 10,000 feet and creating that pathway, whether the contamination traveled all the way up that pathway or partway up that pathway, if it traveled up that pathway at all.
Last question. If all of the best practices increased natural gas costs by $1 per 1,000 cubic feet, would it be better to rely on gas than on oil? And if so, should the state subsidize natural gas production?
I wish I were in a position where it was appropriate for me to answer that question. I have no idea.
Okay. And with that, I think you've done your only job for the day. We've held you up there quite a while. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And,